Hey guys, Alec, Peirce, Vintage Scuba. I want to deal with a topic today that keeps coming up. Now, I have already addressed this numerous times in comments. I keep getting comments, sometimes direct questions. More commonly, it's just an aside as someone's making a comment about, when I took the course, it was long and it was good. I hear this stuff all the time, and I often, if you go look back, you'll find some of my responses to that. So let's deal with it, okay? The scuba courses 20, 30, 40 years ago were long. They weren't good. Sorry guys, if you were trained more than 20 years ago, I don't care what you say, I'm sure your instructor was a wonderful man, a very experienced diver, but the training program was not good. It might have been thorough. You may have learned a whole lot, a little bit of which I'm sure you still remember, but it was not a good training program, not by modern standards. And by modern standards, I mean using modern educational methodology. It was not a good training program. I'm not saying that the divers trained 20, 30, 40 years ago caused all the accidents in those days, but that's a pretty obvious statement for someone to make, isn't it? Scuba diving is much safer today than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. So please, either turn me off if you don't like the sound of this, or listen up. Here we go. I showed two books in my thumbnail for this. I showed this book because this is a book that I was trained from. This is my own manual from 1962. 1960-62. The New Science of Skin and Scuba Diving. Now, just so you know, just so you understand, that I know what I'm talking about. I not only was I there, as a good friend of mine, Elmer Keith, the handgun expert, said, hell, I was there. I was there when all this stuff developed. I was an instructor and I was a store owner. I've owned probably a dozen stores over the years. I was there when this stuff changed, and I've seen the changes and I've seen the results. So please, I'm not the only expert in town, but I'm one of them as far as safety and educational techniques. I was also a professional school teacher for a number of years in the city of Toronto. So again, educational techniques I got a pretty good grasp on. This book is called The New Science of Skin and Scuba Diving. And if you're a Norway diver from more than 20 years ago, this is probably the textbook you used. At one time, Norway did not have their own textbook. They relied very heavily on this book right here, The New Science of Skin and Scuba Diving. It was used by millions of divers. It was their textbook for many, many years, from, gosh, the late 50s to the late 80s. This was the textbook, virtually unchanged. Now, just to show what I know what I'm talking about, this book is called The New Science of Skin and Scuba Diving. How many of you know why it's called The New Science of Skin and Scuba Diving? Oh, wait. It's called The New Science of Skin and Scuba Diving not because it's a new sport, and this is a new book. And so they're introducing some new ideas. No, it's not to do with that. This is called The New Science of Skin and Scuba Diving because it was an updated version of the earlier book called The Science of Skin and Scuba Diving. That's right. This book was written in 1957 by several well-known Navy divers, which, by the way, has nothing to do with recreational diving. But since they were about the only divers around at the time, somebody said, hey, you guys know all about diving with your hard hats and all that junk. Why don't you write a book? So they did. And they called it The Science of Skin and Scuba Diving. Many years later, because they wanted the book to be used in schools and YMCAs and other institutions, they wanted it updated. They wanted it revised and named more towards recreational divers. So they made an update, a reprint. And they called it The New Science of Skin and Scuba Diving. And this book came out in many versions, different covers over the years, over 15 to 20 years. There were several different updates and revisions to this book. But essentially, with all those updates and revisions, it hasn't changed much from this. Quite frankly, it hasn't changed much from this. What's my point? Well, my point is this. This book is full of great information, lots and lots of information. And if you knew everything in this book, then I would certainly concede that you're very knowledgeable about the sport of skin and scuba diving. Whether or not you're a good scuba diver is an entirely different subject. You can memorize this book and it won't make you a good scuba diver. You get my point? This is the book that was used. and it contained everything that any scuba diver could possibly want to know or not want to know. When I took my own scuba training program in 1960, it was 26 weeks long. And people say, well, my course was 12 weeks long. It wasn't 12 weeks long. It was 12 3-hour sessions, of which each 3-hour session, an hour and a half was spent in the classroom. Take out attendance, discipline, getting things organized, you got 1 hour, 8 times. You get 8 hours of actual text instruction. And you had a similar length of time in the pool. 8 hours of pool instruction. Think about it. See if I'm not right. 8 hours in the class, 8 hours in the pool. That's what you got. You did not get 8 or 12 weeks of training. That's to say that is... Anyway. Later, when I started to teach scuba, 1975, I started to teach scuba. I used this book. Yeah, it's a wonderful book, Diving for Fun. I liked this book because the photographs, he used a lot of cartoons in this book, line diagrams. Let me see if I can find one that's particularly good. Some photographs, see stuff like this for physiology. And let me see if I can find one of the cartoons he used to use. See them down here? These goofy cartoons about divers getting into trouble. And so I enjoyed this book. It made teaching scuba fun. I liked laughter in my class. I used this book for about 10 or 12 years. But this book was written by Joe Strakowski. Joe Strakowski was one of the authors in this book, Joe Strakowski. There's a picture of him, diver since the 60s. And he was one of the authors of this book, one of 3 authors. Leo Owen was another one, and Rob Levitt. But Joe Strakowski was one of those authors in this book. And this book is from the 50s. Just crazy. Same guy, same knowledge, same information, wrote this book, which was used in the 70s and the 80s. I think it was used up until almost the 90s until Patty came along. Point to all of this is, these books with all this great information that some of you used years and years ago are wonderful resource materials, but they are not good training textbooks. Again, just to once more establish my credentials, if I may, and I'm not bragging, I'm simply saying I'm an old guy, I've been around a long time, and I'm not sure that's good or bad. And I got a pretty good memory. Before all of these textbooks were printed, before there were textbooks, the companies that sold the gear used to teach about scuba diving. That's right. They made scuba diving equipment to sell for a profit. But people would say, I'd like to buy one of those. I don't know anything about it. So they actually made up a textbook. Aqualung had one. Boyd had one. Healthways had one. All these companies had a textbook. So this is Aqualung's textbook where they teach about diving. You notice there's no photographs in here because there was no underwater photography in the late 50s. You see that? That's what the textbook was like in the late 50s. All right. Now let's deal with the classes. 26 weeks. I went to the YMCA. My dear mother, I was 14, I think, 12 or 14 years old. My dear mother drove me every Tuesday night to the YMCA in Peterborough, 35 miles away, all winter long. Winters in Canada can be very, very harsh. She was a wonderful lady, and she encouraged me to do anything I wanted to do. I wanted to be a frogman. She drove me. Must have been an awful chore. I never realized it until many, many years later. Not the point. The point is that I went for 26 weeks. I learned how to swim. I learned how to be a lifeguard. I learned CPR, the old CPR, Holger Nielsen. Holger Nielsen. Ever hear of Holger Nielsen? Look it up. There's no direct AR in those days. Then I learned how to skin dive with a mask and snorkel. I had been skin diving for several years already. And then finally, at the end of the 26 weeks, for about 4 weeks, we actually got to use tanks. Scuba tanks, yeah, with Mistral 2-hose regulators in them. And we learned all the important stuff. How to take the tank off and leave it on the bottom, which is an important skill if you're a scuba diver. One of the most important things for you to learn is how to take off all your scuba gear and leave it on the bottom and then swim to the surface. We learn how to buddy breathe, which is taboo these days. No one should learn how to no one should teach buddy breathing anymore, in my opinion. And most agencies agree with me. We learn how to buddy breathe with our buddy with no mask on swimming around the pool. Now there is an important skill. I can't remember how many times when I was scuba diving in the ocean when my buddy came up to me and said, let's take off our masks and buddy breathe for a while. I mean, at the time, The theory was that if we bust these guys' behinds, we'll make them into good divers. Well, actually what happened was, out of a class of 36 in the class, 16 graduated, which means 20 did not graduate. They wanted to be scuba divers, but they didn't graduate. What did they do? They went scuba diving anyway. No wonder there were so many accidents. Just the instructor said, you're not good enough to be a scuba diver, kicked them out of the class, so they went scuba diving anyway. You see, the whole methodology was wrong. It was based on the Navy, on the military. If you're not good enough in the military, you kick you out and, I don't know, you become a security guard or something. It doesn't work that way in recreational diving. You want to be a frogman, you want to be a scuba diver, you want to be a scuba diver. If the instructor says you can't do it, you do it anyway. You know how it works. So how has it changed today? Well, today, the most common training program is a 2-day program. 2 days. Typically 12 hours a day. The training program at most of my schools was not quite 12 hours, but close to it. 8 to 10 hours a day. 2 days. Now do the math, it's real simple. Half the day was in the classroom, so there are roughly 6 hours in the classroom, first day, 6 hours the second day. That'd be a total of 12 hours in the classroom, which is 4 hours more than you got. And then the same like the time in the pool. 12 hours in the pool, which is 4 hours more than you got. But that's not important, because it's not the number of hours. Some people would go into the class and they'd already been diving for a while. Their dad was a diver and they'd been trying it at the cottage and they were very familiar. They'd read the book. They don't need to spend 26 weeks. Other people can barely swim, didn't know a mast from a snorkel. They needed a lot more than that. So it has nothing to do with the number of hours. So please don't tell me how many hours you spent in your basic course. It's got nothing to do with it. Maybe you were slow. Or maybe you were very knowledgeable. If you were very knowledgeable, you probably wasted most of that time. If you're a little bit slow, you needed more time. You didn't get it, the course was over, out of here. So you see, it's the methodology. In the modern program, it's called performance-based. So the textbook is straightforward. There's a video, the instructor discusses it briefly, there are quizzes in the book, and then he hands out a quiz at the answer, and then there's a final quiz at the end. It's called repetition. So the important things that you needed to know, like breathing on ascent, monitoring your air control, those things were drilled in. You heard them 6, 7, 8 times through the training program. In your old program years ago, you heard it once. You guys remember to breathe on ascent, eh? Okay, good. Next, on it went. You learned about spearfishing. I did. You learned about underwater photography. You learned about compressors, clean air, how to service your regulator, all that stuff that you don't even use. You never use that today. Total waste of time. And once I heard that you should breathe on ascent. I had to learn how to spell Bernoulli, and I had to know the years that Robert Boyle lived, the year he was born, the year he died. That was important stuff. Oh yeah, really, really important. Understand what I'm saying? Lots of knowledge was thrown at us in the faint hope that the important stuff would stick. The important stuff didn't stick. I still remember how to spell Bernoulli, and I know exactly when Robert Boyle was born and died. Not important. Modern class performance-based. So everything in the classroom, the text, there's visual and audible, and then written quizzes, discussion. So the important stuff in the textbook is drilled in. Now let's go to the pool. What happens in the pool? What's important to a modern scuba diver? Getting the gear assembled safely, getting into the water safely, monitoring his air supply, making proper and safe ascents. Basically it. And then you have emergency procedures beyond that. So getting the gear assembled. Every time you go into the pool, and there are 2 days, so at least 4 times, because we specifically took them out, I think actually it's 5 times is the current process. 5 times those students break down the gear and then they reassemble it. It's like tying your shoelaces. If you haven't learned it after 5 times, buy slip-ons. So they do it 5 times. That may well be more times than you disassembled and assembled your gear. Did they spend any time dropping the gear on the bottom? No. Totally useless, anxiety-ridden exercise. Totally useless. But that was the old philosophy. They thought back then if we really give these guys a hard time, if we rip their mask off, I did it to my students, if we drop their weight belts, blind them, make them super buoyant, and they freak out and go to the surface, they're not good enough to be a diver. I got news for you. A lot of those people, I'm embarrassed to say, became good divers at another course with another instructor or on their own. And they didn't have the advantage of some of the good training and knowledge I could have shared with them. So today it's performance-based. The essential skills. As far as emergency procedures, I hear some folks saying, well, we learned how to buddy breathe. We used to swim around for a half an hour on the bottom buddy breathing with masks off, and wonderful. I think I'm really glad you did it, and you're a frogman and a scuba diver, and you've been very good, obviously, many, many years, and I think it's wonderful. Total waste of time. Buddy breathing is one of the dumbest things, and I did it for years. I did all that stuff. I made my students do it too. But now, in retrospect, with the educational training that I've had, educational training, not scuba diver training, I now realize that was really, really stupid. It is not a safe emergency procedure, certainly not with the modern equipment we have, a safe second. Buddy breathing is just crazy. So I spent all that time swimming around that darn pool on the bottom with a 2-hose rig buddy breathing. Total waste of time. Anyway, the bottom line is this. Modern educational scuba training programs concentrate on what's important for a recreational diver to be able to take part in recreational dives safely. He knows the knowledge that he needs, and he has the skills that he needs. That's it. Nothing else. His mind is not cluttered up with anything else. There's no anxiety particularly because he knows he can do that. He knows what to do if his mask floods and all that rig comes out, never goes back in. He knows all that stuff. That's all he knows. He knows nothing about compressors, spearfishing, photography, how to fix his rig, none of that stuff. Because he's never going to do that. Now the other part of the educational philosophy today that's important, this is important because it used to be years ago, you would take the open water training program, what we call basic diver, and then someone would say, okay, now you dive for a couple of years, and when you've got lots of diving experience, you come back and you can take the advanced training program. Hell, by the time he comes back in 2 years, he knows more than you're going to teach him on the advanced program. Didn't make much sense. He's an open water diver, basic diver. Oh, you got to get a couple of years of experience and come back. 3 weeks later, his buddy asks him, well, why don't we go down to 100 feet? So they do. A month later, he says, let's go and do a night dive. So they do. What are you going to teach him on the advanced program? There's nothing left. No, current philosophy, you take the open water training program, and then as quickly as possible, the next weekend, if possible, you do the advanced training program, because the advanced training program builds on the open water training program. You get more practice of those same important skills, plus additional skills. And then you take, if you're interested in regulator service, you take an equipment program, and on it goes. Anyway, you think about it, guys. I'm not giving you a hard time. I'm simply saying that I've dealt with this subject many, many times. I've seen the results. Statistically, I'm really sorry, but us old guys ought not to be here, and not just because of our age. The training that we received was very, very thorough. It just wasn't very good. Today, new divers don't learn nearly as much. They're not exposed. I shouldn't say learn. They're not exposed to nearly as much. But the basics, the important things that they need to know to survive, they know really, really well. You think about that a little wee bit, and I'm sure I'll get comments on this, and I appreciate the comments. I love them. Keep them coming, and I'll talk to you again real soon. Alec, Peirce, vintage scuba diving in the Stone Age. I love that. Bye-bye.